The morning after my cousin's wedding, I opened my banking app while still in my hotel room, still wearing yesterday's mascara, and watched the number on the screen refuse to make sense. $47,000. Gone. Not transferred. Not pending. Gone the way water disappears when you tip a glass. Cleanly and without apology. My sister had called it the wedding of the decade. 3 days in Niagara-on-the-Lake. A vineyard venue. An open bar that lasted until 2 in the morning. Everyone had flown or driven in. My aunt from Kelowna, my uncle from Halifax, and my older brother, whom I hadn't seen in 8 months, who had hugged me at the rehearsal dinner and said, quietly into my hair, "You look like you're doing really well." Claire. I had been doing really well. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and read the transaction history 3 times. 1 transfer. Executed at 1147 p.m. the previous night while the reception was still going. While I was dancing with my cousin in her dress. While the string lights were still glowing over the vineyard. The transfer had gone to an account I didn't recognize. It had been authorized with my credentials. From a device I had never seen before. I knew, without having to think very hard, exactly who had done it. Let me go back a few years. Because none of this will make sense without context. I'm 31. I work as a licensed practical nurse at a hospital in Toronto. And 2.5 years ago, I started a side business, a small medical staffing agency that connects healthcare facilities in Ontario with vetted short-term nurses and PSWs. It took me 18 months to get it off the ground properly. I applied for a Canada Small Business Financing loan. I worked with an accountant. I kept meticulous records. I was proud of it in the quiet, private way. You're proud of things you built entirely by yourself. My older brother, I'll call him my brother, throughout this is 4 years older than me and has, for most of his adult life, operated in a financial gray zone. Not criminal, not exactly, but always 1 foot over a line. He's flipped houses that weren't quite legal flips. Gotten involved in partnerships that dissolved badly. Borrowed money from our parents with a handshake and repaid them with excuses. He's charming in the way that people who need things from you tend to be charming. He knows how to make you feel like you're the only person in the room. When I launched my business, he was genuinely supportive. He helped me move office furniture. He shared my social media posts. He took me for dinner at a steakhouse on King Street to celebrate when I signed my first contract. I remember thinking this is a new chapter. We're adults now. It's different. What I didn't know then was that he had spent the previous 6 months quietly, methodically memorizing my life. He knew I used the same password format across personal accounts. He knew my banking institution. He knew that my business operating account, the one I'd funded with the CSBF loan plus my own savings, sat at just over $47,000 after expenses. He knew because I had told him. Over that steakhouse dinner, when he asked how things were going, and I, feeling safe and celebratory, had answered honestly, I know now that he had been planning for months. I just didn't see it. At the wedding, 2 nights before everything fell apart, my brother had asked to borrow my phone charger. His was in the car. He said. The reception hall was loud. I handed it over without thinking. What I didn't notice, what I had no reason to notice, was that he'd spent 11 minutes at a table near the back corner, not charging his phone, but using my charger adapter to briefly connect something else. A small device. I've since learned what it was, a portable reader that can, if positioned correctly and used with the right credentials, authorize banking access from an associated device. He had the credentials already. He'd gotten them the old-fashioned way, watching me type on my laptop the week before the wedding. When we'd been at our parents' house in Oakville for the pre-wedding dinner, and I had stepped away briefly to handle a payroll issue, and he had stood close enough behind me without me ever once suspecting he would do what he was about to do. By 11:47 p.m. on the night of the reception, while I danced, he had moved $47,000 out of my business operating account. When I confronted him the next morning standing in the hotel hallway in my coat, my voice very steady, my hands not steady at all, he didn't deny it. He didn't yell. He didn't tell me I was crazy or that I had the wrong person. He leaned against the wall, crossed his arms, and said, "You have more than enough to rebuild. Claire, I needed it more right now. That's just how it is. That's just how it is." I want you to understand what those words felt like. Not because I want your sympathy, though I'll admit I needed it in that moment, but because those 5 words are the reason I did everything I did afterward with complete and total clarity. There was no part of me that hesitated. There was no version of events in which I thought, maybe he's right. Maybe I should let this go. Maybe this is just family. He had stolen $47,000 from a business I had built with my hands. And he had done it at a wedding. And he had told me, to my face, that it was fine. I smiled at him. I told him I understood. Then I went back to my room, sat at the desk, opened my laptop, and started building the case that would cost him everything. The first call I made was to my bank. I reported the unauthorized transfer immediately, gave them every detail I had, and asked them to flag the transaction. They opened a fraud investigation within the hour. The money was already gone. The receiving account had been emptied almost immediately, which told me he'd had a plan in place, but the report created a paper trail. That paper trail mattered. The second call I made was to a lawyer. I want to be clear about something here, because I know what some people will think pursuing this legally against a family member feels extreme. I've heard that. I anticipated it. I want to address it directly. My brother didn't make a desperate mistake. He didn't borrow money without asking in a moment of panic. He spent weeks planning this, executed it at a family event while I was celebrating someone I loved. And when I confronted him, he expressed zero remorse. That is not a mistake. That is a calculated act by someone who had decided that my work, my livelihood, and my future were acceptable losses for his benefit. I don't owe peace to people who took mine. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who works out of a firm near Young and Bloor, told me what I already suspected: we had a strong case. Unauthorized electronic transfer with documented credentials theft fell under both criminal and civil jurisdiction. We could pursue him criminally through the police, which I did, filing a report with Toronto Police Service within 48 hours and simultaneously file a civil suit for damages. What I hadn't anticipated was what my lawyer discovered when she started pulling records. My brother didn't have the $47,000 anymore. He had already moved it into a series of smaller accounts, spent a portion on something I'll get to, and transferred the rest offshore. What he did have, what he had been quietly acquiring for the past 3 years, was equity. His name was on a property in Hamilton, a semi-detached he'd purchased with a partner who had since walked away, leaving him as the sole owner. Market value at the time of our suit, just under $380,000. His outstanding mortgage, roughly $210,000. The math was not complicated. I spent the 3 months between filing the suit and the court date doing something that required more discipline than I knew I had. I acted completely normal around my family. My parents didn't know what had happened. I made that decision deliberately, and I stand by it. My parents are in their 60s. My mother has a heart condition. They love my brother the way parents love the child who needs them most, with an exhausting, unconditional devotion that had, over the years, cost them more than they'd ever admitted. I didn't want them caught in the middle of something that was between me and him. I wanted them safe and outside of it until there was nothing left to shield them from. At Thanksgiving, 2 months after the wedding, my brother sat across the table from me and made everyone laugh with a story about a terrible Airbnb he'd stayed in outside Montreal. He passed me the rolls. He complimented my haircut. He was, as he had always been, excellent company. I watched him perform, and I thought about my lawyer's last email, which I had read that morning. She had found the paper trail. She had connected the offshore transfer. She had a court date confirmed for the 3rd week of November. I smiled and said, "Thank you for the compliment about my hair." What I did tell my parents, finally, was 2 days before the hearing. I drove to Oakville on a Tuesday evening and sat with them in the kitchen and told them the full story. I had a folder with me not for them, but for me, because having something concrete in my hands helped me stay calm. I told them what he had done, when he had done it, and what was about to happen. My mother was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I want to call him." I said, "That's your choice. But the hearing is on Thursday, and nothing changes that." My father didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked, quietly, "How are you doing?" That was the only moment I came close to crying. The civil hearing wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine court to be dramatic. There were no speeches. There was no moment where someone broke down. There was documentation and testimony, and a judge who asked clarifying questions in a dry, precise voice. And at the end of it, there was a judgment. My brother was ordered to repay the $47,000 in full, plus legal costs, plus damages that brought the total to just over $61,000. Because he did not have $61,000 in accessible funds, something that came out during discovery, the court authorized enforcement action against his property. The Hamilton semi-detached was sold 8 weeks later, under a court-supervised process, for $362,000. After the mortgage was cleared and the legal costs were settled and my judgment was paid in full, my brother walked away with approximately $70,000. 2 years ago, that house had been his plan. His retirement, his proof that he'd built something. He had shown it to me once, proudly, walking me through the rooms he'd renovated himself. I didn't feel good about that part. I want to be honest about that. I felt something more complicated, a kind of grief that sat right next to the relief. The way two things can be true at the same time, without canceling each other out. I had wanted my money back. I had wanted accountability. I had not wanted to be someone who took her brother's house, but I also knew that I hadn't done that to him. He had done it to himself. The night he decided my life was something he could take from, the criminal case moved more slowly, as criminal cases do. He accepted a plea arrangement fraud over $5,000, which carries real weight on a record, and received a conditional sentence and restitution order. His lawyer argued mitigating circumstances. My lawyer made sure the court heard the premeditation. He did not go to prison. I know that bothers some people. It bothered me, in the abstract. But what the conviction did was permanent. It's on his record in a way that follows him, that shows up in background checks, that tells any future partner or investor or employer exactly what kind of person he decided to be on a warm night in September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. My business survived. That matters to me more than anything else in this story. The fraud investigation at my bank resulted in a partial recovery, not the full amount, but enough to keep my payroll funded, while the civil suit worked its way through. I took a short-term line of credit to cover the gap. I renegotiated 2 contracts. I called every client I had and was honest with them. There had been a financial disruption. It was being resolved. And their placements were not affected. Not one of them left. I've since hired 2 people. One of them is a woman I met at a small business networking event in Etobicoke who had started her own HR consultancy and needed flexible admin work while she built her client base. She's meticulous and kind and completely trustworthy in the specific way that people who have been burned before tend to be trustworthy. The other is a young man, fresh out of a medical office administration program at George Brown, who answers his emails faster than anyone I've ever worked with. They don't know the full story. They know I started the business on my own and that it went through a difficult period. That's enough. My relationship with my brother is, for now, over. Not because I am angry. I was angry. And then I wasn't. And then I was something quieter and more permanent. But because trust, once you've seen clearly what someone is willing to do with it, doesn't rebuild itself. It doesn't work like a bone that heals stronger at the break. Some things just stay broken. And you decide whether to keep handling the pieces or to set them down. I set them down. My parents have struggled with this. My mother, especially. has tried a few times to reopen the door to suggest a conversation. A mediated meeting. Some version of forgiveness that looks like the family she wants us to be. I understand that impulse. I hold no resentment toward her for it. She loves her children and she wants them whole. And I am one of the pieces of something that isn't whole anymore. But I've learned something in the last year and a half that I keep coming back to. Protecting yourself is not the same as being cold. Refusing to re-enter a situation where you were harmed is not cruelty. You are allowed to love someone and still refuse to be available to them. You are allowed to grieve a relationship and still know, clearly and calmly, that stepping back was the right thing. I didn't build my business so that someone could take it from me at a wedding. I built it so that I could stand in my own life and call it mine. A few months ago, I was driving back from a client visit in Mississauga. It was a Tuesday. The kind of gray November afternoon that feels like the sky is thinking about something, and I found myself running the numbers in my head the way I do sometimes. Without meaning to. Current contracts. Outstanding invoices. Payroll for the month. Projections for Q1. They were good numbers. Genuinely good. Better. Actually, than they'd been before the wedding. I don't say that to suggest that what happened was worth it, or that things work out for a reason, or any of the tidy phrases people reach for when hard stories end. Okay, what happened was not worth it. It cost me money and months, and a version of my family that I used to think was real. What I'll say instead is this: I came through it. Not despite doing the hard thing, the legal action, the confrontation, the Thanksgiving table, and the conversation in my parents' kitchen, but partly because of it. There is something clarifying about being forced to see a situation exactly as it is, without the softening lens of hope or history or love. You find out what you're made of. You find out who you are when the thing you built is threatened. I found out I'm someone who protects what she built. I found out that's enough. If you're sitting with something right now, a family member who borrowed and never repaid, and a situation where you stayed quiet because the cost of speaking felt too high, I'm not going to tell you what to do. These situations are not simple, and anyone who says they are hasn't lived one. What I'll tell you is what I wish someone had told me. Somewhere between that hotel room and the Tuesday, I drove home from Mississauga with good numbers in my head. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to name what happened to you. You are allowed to pursue what was taken from you without apologizing for the pursuit. Your peace is yours. Protect it like it is.